Oh, takepi. Chante washtea nape chuzapi. Dakota imakiapie, Lakota wiya hemacha, gawazi aha el omawapi. Hello, my relatives. I shake all of your hands with a good heart. My name's Dakota. I'm a Lakota woman. I'm enrolled in the Pine Ridge Reservation. Today, I am giving this talk from Minnesota Mkoche, the traditional homelands of the Dakota people, who also share this land base with the Anishinaabe and people from many other Indigenous nations. I live and work in Denver, which is, along with the surrounding area, today known as Colorado, the homeland of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, the Ute tribes and the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations. There are also many other nations with ties and connections to that place, both historically and today. Today and every day, I try to serve my Indigenous community, although often imperfectly, because for me, our histories as Native people, our present and our futures are some of the most important things in my world. Thank you to the AAMC for selecting my panel, and also to Judith Pinheiro and Lucy Leiden for their patience and guidance in assisting and setting up this talk. The panelists assembled here today hold a lot of wisdom. I honestly feel blessed with knowledge whenever I hear them speak or just have the opportunity to have a conversation with them. We had a fifth panelist, Chief Arvel Looking Horse, who unfortunately could not be with us today as he had a death in his family and is conducting the funeral today. I'm going to quickly introduce the panelists, but Lucy Leiden will put their full bios in the chat section because they are have far greater experience than we have time, and honors than we have time to recount here. But you're really in for a treat in listening to all of these people speak today. Jolene Ricard is the Associate Professor in the Department of Art and the Department of History and Art and Visual Studies at Cornell University. She has spoken widely on this subject, and she considers herself a sovereigntist, which is a wonderful and forward-thinking position to take for our Native nations. Bob Casalino is the Patrick and Amy Butler Curator of Paintings at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, where I had the pleasure to make his acquaintance. He loves to add nuance and tell stories in his curatorial practice that might otherwise go untold. Andrea Carlson is a fine artist and Ojibwe person who challenges museum practices in her artwork and writing, problematizing cultural narratives and institutional authority. She thinks deeply and thoughtfully about what it means to show her work in Western museums. All right. Just a little background on why I wanted to put this panel together. I was working with Bob Cozzolino at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and he was working very thoughtfully and really starting to integrate a lot of Native art into the galleries that he was charged with. And I was starting to hear rumblings about this from a lot of people who are shepherding American art galleries. And there was just a part of me that was like, whoa. I felt like it was moving too fast. And I just wanted to have a talk with these folks today and with all of you about, okay, we're moving forward. I know that this is really an act of people that just want to do something good and something right and increase the story. But I was also felt like I want to also consider our future patrimony. I want to also consider our sovereignty. And I also want to consider, like, this is a great effort, but so many times in our Indigenous experience, people are making decisions to benefit us, but they haven't really asked us if that's what we would like or not. And so that was kind of the impetus for me starting with this talk. And I just feel really thankful for all of you who are kind of willing to take this verbal journey with me today. I'm going to start this off with a question to Bob, just since this is kind of where this all started for me. Bob, I know you're trying to disrupt American ideas and stereotypes, as well as provide nuanced and informed experience that really broaden people's mind. And I also know you have a close relationship with a lot of Indigenous artists in your museum, and you just really want to provide opportunity and voice to those artists. Can you just talk a little bit about how you began forming your thoughts, including more Native artists? Because I know you weren't also that familiar with Native people in your former position. Go.
Thanks, Dakota. I am too. I'm with Dakota. I'm speaking to you from Dakota Land in what is now called Minnesota. And I have been here since 2016. And I would say that it's taken 5 years, my whole time here, to get to a place where I'm able to start this work. And I want to say to all curators who specialize in art of the United States that it has to take time. It is going too fast. There's a lot that I've learned by talking to Indigenous artists, listening to and being in the presence of Indigenous elders here, and doing a lot of watching and listening. My entry point, as Dakota suggested, was through my first experience coming into the museum that I now work at and seeing a George Morrison piece. And having a kind of decentering experience by being completely amazed by the object, and also recognizing that I was not taught who George Morrison was. And his work in my entire career, there may have been a little mention of him in a book, but I didn't really know who George Morrison was. I have never really called myself an Americanist, although I've done a lot of work on artists active in the United States. Because I really look at the lives and careers and experiences of artists. And it doesn't matter where they're from, what their background is. And my approach as a curator has been to really value place and to understand the context and the community in which I am working in. So when I lived in Philadelphia, I got to know the communities there. When I moved to Minnesota, there was a completely different kind of cultural community and situation in history here that I knew immediately that I had to learn to respect, to acknowledge, and to figure out what my role was as a curator at a major public institution to make those narratives, to the best of my ability, present, to not conceal or deny any of the histories that have happened, and to work closely with folks who are Indigenous artists and talk to them and to walk through the galleries with them and to understand how they see the displays, how they want their work to be seen and where they want their work to be seen, and to really kind of do a collaboration through that process. With George Morrison, who died before I could meet him, I looked at the archive and I looked at where his work was situated in the museum when I first started, which was in a series of Indigenous art galleries, which was good and bad in some ways because, to my colleague Jill Alberg-Yo's credit, the Native art galleries at the Minneapolis Institute have past and present talking to one another and also signal towards the future in those spaces. And so Morrison was there in a context that brought out his sort of Ojibwe background. But Morrison exhibited his work in an art world in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, where he was seen alongside of and reacting to the work of his peers like Franz Klein and Louise Nevelson and folks that he knew very well and closely and was sort of competing with even. And so when Dakota says I began this work, the very tentative first step was to take Morrison's work and move it into the space in a different part of the museum where we could see it in a new context, which was the context that Morrison presented the work in. At the same time, we left work by Morrison in Jill's galleries to acknowledge that Morrison himself acknowledged a multiplicity of identity and wanted to be seen in lots of different ways. And so it's complicated. So when I say it's taken 5 years to sort of begin this work, I have a lot of lessons that I've learned along the way, but I would say that curators need to understand what community you live in, to understand that you're on native land. Whether you are going to curate Indigenous art or not, I think that it's your responsibility as somebody on this landmass to understand where you are and what community you're creating in. And to really listen to what Indigenous artists have to say about where they want to be seen and how they want to be seen. And it's probably not going to be just one way. So my way is to try to listen to that and to collaborate with them to do that. But again, as I said, I'm just at the very beginning of starting to then figure out what does that mean in the American galleries. And I think it has to be slow work and it has to be work that's done in collaboration.
Andrea or Jolene, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, George Morrison, because he's not the only artist, right? That was kind of, Kay Walking Stick or Jean Quick to See Smith. At the time, I know Morrison was really fighting for his right to be recognized as an artist at a time when Indigenous people, well, I don't know, let's just say at that generation, they felt that they had a lot to prove. And do you think how they might see that now would change a little bit? Just curious about that.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dakota. I'm talking today from the homelands of the Haudenosaunee people, specifically the Tuscarora Nation, which is in the western door of the Seneca Nation. So thank you for inviting me to speak this afternoon, and thank you already for really stimulating thoughts, Robert. Really important. I think that what you're saying is relevant to, I think, some of the thoughts that I'm also thinking at this point in time. Yes, I was a young artist during and have met actually Morrison. And there was an arts organization. I might start with just a little bit of history. There was an arts organization called Adelaide, which actually brought together a number of, at the time, the language that was in play was Native artists from across North America. But it also brought these artists in dialogue with the emergent and ongoing Chicano discourse, and also today what we think of as Latinx, and also African Americans. It was an incredibly rich moment. And so I would say from the 1970s to the 1980s, my experience with that moment, and it actually goes back to, I would argue, the 1950s, where we see artists from Native communities, and today we're using the language of Indigenous, or all of these things is representing, discrete cosmological and political entities that I would like to argue should be thought of as nations. And so for me, the discussion of nationhood, of course, is challenged in the field of Indigenous studies, challenged and supported simultaneously. And so I think that your question for me brings up a number of really complex cultural subjectivities. And so for the individual artists, coming from within our communities, yes, there was this moment where the goal was to simply be recognized as an artist within a broader discourse. And so I do think that many people from that generation are simultaneously also understanding and supportive of this idea of not only individual recognition, but also of the cultural construct and history that they're coming from as being critical then to the importance of their work. And so, you know, for me, then the question goes to what does Indigenous art represent, you know, at this period of time, and what did it represent historically? And so I think that we can read it through a number of different lenses. But what it represents, I think, in part, represents the ongoing articulation of Indigenous philosophies that really need to be understood in ways that are not encumbered by, you might think of it as encumbered by an ongoing colonization. And so how do we then, in the fields that we're in, create a space for recognizing entirely different worldviews, entirely different ways of understanding time and place, while at the same time working with an aesthetic vocabulary that is informed both by very ancient understandings and also, you know, contemporary academia. And so it's that sort of space that I think, this very complicated space that our artists work within today. And, you know, if art is a portal into how we understand anything in society, you know, then we have to begin to be, I think, better at informing ourselves about what is Indigenous space. So today, of course, there's a broad sort of uptake of this idea of Indigenous futurity, this idea of continually recognizing the ongoing formation of Indigenous cultures. So some of this is bound by, you know, political framings, and then some of it is bound by anti-racist discourse. Some of it is bound by a desire to decolonize, or a desire to at least recognize colonial framings. And then, of course, I think then there's the you know, the incredible role of the artist as individual, and the kinds of work that they're making and how they're locating themselves within that discussion. So the educated person who's negotiating this space really needs to be attentive to, I would argue, all of those things. And so within the field of art history, the impact of the role of the field of Native American and Indigenous studies, and in the fields of museum studies or curatorial practice, you know, we have to begin to re-articulate what what the philosophical spaces are for Indigenous peoples, because we certainly teach in those fields from a very, you know, it's anchored very much in a Euro-Western philosophical space. And so how do we then really begin to raise the rigor on understanding Indigenous philosophy and subjectivity? And how do we do this in a way that doesn't compromise the, you might say, the autonomy of the individual artist? And so I think that I sometimes think those early days were often almost innocent days, you know, where the artist was simply asking through the sheer force and quality of their work to be recognized. Today, I think the space is occupied in a much more, politicized way, with a keener kind of sensitivity to what's at stake, you know. And I'll leave it there to give others some more time to address this. And I know that Andrea could also speak to this as well.
Well, and I just was also thinking, you know, it's too bad you didn't lay any wisdom on us here that I would have anything to respond to in my questions, because I think, you know, Andrea, I certainly want you to say anything, you know, anything that you feel moved to say, but something that comes up when I'm hearing Jolene talk, at least for me, is, you know, also this idea of like standardization and whose standards are, you know, who is privileged when we move things into American art. I know I'd love to hear what you think about Morrison and those guys, but I know you also have really interesting talks about, you know, like turning this concept of including things into American art really on its head. So feel free to address any of those things.
Well, first of all, I'm speaking from Anishinaabe land, specifically the Three Fires Council, which is the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe people in Chicago. So I think that's, I really, there's so many things that Jolene was saying that, like, just as an artist, really speak true to me, being the subject of other people's writings and curation. And Dakota and Jolene are also artists here and can speak from both the curators and artists kind of view. I know that as a subject, often if my work is going to be kind of brought in as American art, I always question, how much does it cost to play? How much do you have to pay to play? And if we're brought in, are we brought in under what terms? And are those terms even made clear to us as artists? I mean, these categorizations in the end are going to affect artists, how we perceive ourselves and how we, you know, practice going forward, where we fit, where we belong. And is our belonging always nested and why is American considered the greater categorization? I know with George Morrison, I've written in the past that I thought that he wanted universality, like he wanted to be able to move from subject to subject, that he wanted to be able to address things without always having his work interpreted as being, you know, authentic Native art. He wanted that individuality. He didn't want to necessarily always have to play with signifiers or always have his work understood in terms of indigeneity or Ojibwe. And I've had this happen to my own work while I've painted something that has nothing to do with my Ojibwe-ness. And I've had writers approach it with only knowing that I'm Native and trying to force everything into a Native understanding of things, or try to perform that the work is performing in a Native way when it isn't. And those are, you know, sometimes very unusual reads of my work. So there's that. I also feel like George Morrison and Kay Walking Stick and Jean-Claude C. Smith, you know, rejection can happen in more than one way. So we can be rejected as not American and pushed out of institutions because we're in this you know, we're in the penumbra, or we can be rejected by Native communities as not Indian enough, not Native enough, not performing in ways that are immediately recognizable, or using signifiers that read as Indigenous. So we can be rejected from institutions, we can be rejected from our own. And then when we as artists want to engage in bigger museums and institutions, we can also be accused of wanting it both ways, you know, of wanting to have our work outside of the box of American art, but not fully in Native art, if that's a thing. So I feel like I always go back to how much does it cost to play this game? And if it means that I have to go into these institutions in a racialized category, you know, to go back to what Jolene is saying about sovereignty, if the museum understands Native people as a racialized category, and they're like, come in because you are American and we're bestowing this gift of Americanness on you, and you're a race, you're participating as what we understand these frameworks around race, and then Natives are coming in and saying, well, you know, we're enrolled, we have nations, we have ways of recognizing who we are. And that typically confuses many institutions, I would say. I'll leave it at that.
One thing, I mean, I think that's totally true. And I think the complicated nature, it also takes some patience and understanding to work and trying to relate that across an institutional platform. But I was really struck by something you said, Andrea, about these categorizations are how we will learn to see ourselves in the future. And I think that is exactly kind of why I was also worried, like, oh, breaks, because I'm thinking of like, what happens if things get moved into this American category for our own linear progression, for our own children who are going to look back on their native ancestry and say like, oh, we came from this and we had these great artists like all the way through time. Not that we had these great artists up to 1920 and then we had this really great big long break where everybody was in modern art. And so I guess what I'm exploring here too is, and you also touched on it, is, you know, I'm thinking of the lineage of our people, but I'm also thinking about the individual artist who doesn't want to, I mean, there's access, right? By coming into one collection versus the other, there's access not just to visibility, but to markets, to, you know, financial means, all of that. And I see Bob's off mute, so I think I might send it down to him, and then Andrea can respond, or either of you can respond.
Well, you know, both Jolene and Andrea were touching on this, and it's something that I feel keenly and have always felt, you know, since I was an undergrad, which is that so much of art history, and American art history in particular, is, you know, people who are the gatekeepers, who are building the canons and then protecting them at all costs, coming up with labels and taxonomies and bins and placing things neatly and tidily in these things. And art is never that way, and artists do not think that way. And so the entire history of art as a Western construct, and especially American art, has been this kind of cavalcade of bin making and label making. And if you are not able to fit in any of those categories, which are completely arbitrary and about the assertion of power in the first place, then you fall through the cracks. And so there is so much that has been lost in general in telling that history, because it has been so much of a history of this kind of rigid series of one thing succeeding another because of somebody's prescribed idea of what progress is. And then also the way that museums still have their departments are in these rigid categories of different kinds of fields. And so few artists, I don't know a single artist that I've ever met of whatever generation that I've been engaged with, whether it was Morrison's generation or Andrea's, feels strongly about being put in a bin, and wants to be able to move fluidly around the art world in any way they see fit, because people are so much more complicated than that. And so I have always sort of pushed back against this, and then have pushed back as well against the kind of thing that I do, which is not going to go along with that. And just one other thing about American art history that I think we all need to kind of start thinking about in the field is that, you know, we know that American history has been taught with all sorts of, you know, absences and denials and obfuscation of the truth, and pretending like things didn't happen. And I think American art history, largely as a field, has paralleled that. And we're just starting to see the very beginnings of the fruits of dismantling that kind of thing in the field. And so that is where it has to go. And whether or not, you know, the sovereignty of Native art in all of its different kind of full iterations belongs with that is a question that I would leave really to Indigenous knowledge keepers, not me necessarily. But I do think that having an art museum where there are conversations and there's interaction and there's a kind of intersectionality between artworks rather than fitting one thing into another is really more of a productive way of thinking.
Well, I do agree, because I think some of this comes back to, well, then what are the lenses through which we're viewing these works? Is it through that Western lens, much to your, which is kind of funny, like the Americans are trying to prove they're as European as the Europeans, and, all of those kind of things. So I like, Andrea, when you speak about how you wanted to come through the front door and found something that was, really solidifying for you by doing that. And just recently, your opinion around that has started to shift slightly. Would you like to speak to that a little bit?
Well, I think maybe earlier in my career, when I got a MFA around 2006, I had noticed that my art, how it was being, opportunities that were being offered to me were more, the Native art being curated under the terms of whatever Native art is. Now we have over 500 tribes. The term Native art is very narrowing, or very in a way, it kind of crams a lot of people, a lot of different desires, and a lot of different communities together under one term. And I don't know if that even that's its own conversation. But I was noticing early on in my career that a lot of the opportunities being offered to me were with the premise of you're participating under the terms of Native art, or there was other opportunities being afforded to me because I'm a woman, and which is absolutely fine. But I was looking at male colleagues taking the front door where their identity wasn't addressed at all. Their identity was not used as a filter to view their art. They had subjects. These white male artists had their subjects that they could study. They could talk about the surveillance state. They could talk about, religion, any religion they wanted. They could even make Native people into their subjects. But as a Native artist, if you're operating under those terms, that's how your work will be read, which, I definitely subscribe to that. But I was noticing that I wasn't able to take the front door. It was special awards. It was special funding. It was amplifying my identity for opportunity instead of, which still afforded the front door for artists that were white and male and maybe settlers. So that being said, my shift happened after I started taking the front door, and it wasn't interesting for me. I realized that I wasn't considering audience, and that part of what the motivation behind doing my work is I want to impress people like Jolene. I want to impress Native colleagues and peers. And then I started relocating my desire, and I want what white men have and what's afforded to them. I want that universality. I started relocating my desire, and I want opportunities that where Natives are holding each other up, where Natives are offering space to each other, where we're amplifying each other's voice. And I shifted maybe my desire in my career to be more towards my community, which of course changes over time as well. So that took some time, because it took over a decade to kind of to shift, and it wasn't intentional. It was just, I've just noticed over time that I was starting to get bored pursuing the front door. So.
Well, and I think I first met you probably in about 2009, because you came and did a lecture when I was working on my BFA. And then later and you were right, at that, still going through the front door phase. And later on, when I had come to work at MIA, I remember thinking to myself, there's like a cartoon, and I don't remember, it's probably some weird Disney thing, but it was like the guy was like pounding on the door going like, let me in, let me in, let me in. And the other guy was pounding on the door on the other side saying, let me out, let me out, let me out. And I kind of felt like, you know, you and I were like those two cartoon characters. You know, I was like wanting my art to look and feel and be considered more native, because I had been trained in a, you know, purely Western school, and you were trying to get the recognition the other way. And so again, it kind of comes back to the personal nature for the artists of, you know, where they're at in their life, what they're trying to achieve. And, you know, though all of those things are kind of morphing with time. And that really leads me to something that you said, Jolene. It was just really beautiful in one of our earlier talks. And you were saying, instead of fitting Indigenous artwork into American, European, Native, traditional, contemporary, you know, and you were throwing out all the categories that we have, you asked the question, like, how can we elevate globally all artists and art forms, or even establish different ideas around this way to classify everything? So with this, I'd like you to answer this very little small question. No, I really, you know, really, I'd like to hear you speak to that a little bit more, if you would.
Thank you, Dakota. I think your earlier point about how will people find us in the future, I think is really important because of the way in which information is categorized now. And so we're experiencing this moment where our engagement with each other is primarily online. And for researchers in the future, I don't think that's going to change. I think your first point of contact or entry will be through the algorithms of the internet, as well as the way in which we're categorized in metadata. And so when we look at the Library of Congress, you know, we're identified as, you know, American Indians. And so almost a language, a terminology that none of our young people are using anymore. Yet this is the way in which, you know, libraries identify us. And so the kind of ways in which we're categorized in the archive, I think will and now needs to be at the heart of this discussion. And these terms, I think, are significant because they impact and recognize our sovereignty. They recognize our own notions of how we understand our communities and nationhood. They position us in relationship to settler states. And they also provide an opportunity for either invisibility, erasure, or for ongoing recognition as Indigenous peoples within our own kind of cultural constructs. And so there's a difference, I think, between those spaces, how those spaces are organized, and then our individual relationship to the philosophies of the heritages that we come from. And so they're not the same or equal. So we have some people who have a connection to our communities, but they have almost no understanding of the teachings or philosophies that have defined our relationships and responsibilities to each other for millennia. And so I think part of my part of the things that I think about is how do we create a more articulate way of understanding that there are some artists that come from our community that actually provide insight into that thinking, and some artists that are appropriating that thinking as a means to market themselves. And so I think both of these, like there's, a kind of extreme ends of a continuum. And so this goes to, that all of the voices in Indigenous are not equal. And that, But it doesn't impinge or suggest that someone's art is better or less than another person's art making process. And so it just depends on, you know, how we really begin to understand these things. And so, like, as a Haudenosaunee person, there are any number of people appropriating the use of our wampum as art making strategy. And when I look at it, I you know, think it's my responsibility to critique it. Excuse me, to critique it in a way that suggests what our positionality on that will be. And it's difficult to do this because sometimes the most interesting art speaks to, isn't speaking to the same audience that, how can I say this? So sometimes the most interesting art isn't the most informed art about the teachings of this idea. And so there's a lot of work that we need to do, infrastructure that we need to do, I think, as far as representing and speaking for ourselves about how we read this work. So there's this, I would argue there's a big area of open for Indigenous criticism. And this is almost non-existent at this point. And so we need a stronger critique about our own art. And I think that this will help to inform an allied scholar audience about what we're thinking about this. And it's really difficult to get at this point in time. And so, you know, the strategy of interviewing the artists and asking the artists what they think about these ideas needs to, you know, is typically a good strategy. But what if the artist doesn't really understand the traditional concepts they're working with? And so does the person that's interviewing you even understand that? And so I think that there's a huge, and so this is where the field of Native American and Indigenous studies comes into play. And so I think informed intellectuals in this area are working with multiple disciplinary basis in order to really kind of open this space up further. So there's a question in the chat that says, how do we move forward? So that's how, one of the things that I'm thinking is that we need actually to have more rigor in our analysis of the art. And we also need to then have more strategic discussion about how we're located in the digital archive, which accesses the material archive. And then I think we always need to be generous in that if our young artists who are coming up through our communities don't understand these ideas and they're working with them, we need to work with them so that they can grow and learn. And so I benefited greatly from that generation of artists that you mentioned earlier. They were very nurturing and, you know, really were I think really provided many mentorship opportunities. I'm here today because of them in this space. And I think that we always need to keep that value in our thinking, that we are here because of the people that came before us. And so in the arts world, I don't think that's always present. So we need to bring our values into this space that is only sometimes focused on the next generation or what's new. I think we need to resist that, and we need to look at it intergenerationally as well.
You know, Andrea, you talked about that a bit when you were in conversation with Santiago X, that you started writing criticism in part because you felt like there was this need to really come at it with an informed point of view.
Yeah, it was kind of drug into having to write, pulled in, because oftentimes these shows would come up and go down without any reviews or criticism, especially if it was work by Native artists. The risk is that these are my friends and colleagues and I'm an artist. So it's a really weird position to be in. But I was noticing that, my own shows were going up and coming down without any critical engagement. People would show up maybe for an opening, but it was, I also, a few writers, white writers would approach me like, oh, I love your work so much, but I'm not Native, so I won't touch it with a 10-foot pole. I got that a number of times too, where I was untouchable because I would be referencing maybe something that they were uncomfortable with talking to me about. And that got me thinking, if my career was if I was only written about by other Native and Native curators, I might have that might be limiting to my career. But then, so I just, instead of just complaining about it, I tried to step up and start writing about other artists' artwork. And I knew George. He is also Grand Portage Ojibwe, and he died in 2000. I think he would be 100 or over 100 years old now if he was alive today. But I knew him when I was a kid, and he told me, start out young and paint until you die. He instructed me to paint until I die. And he also told me to go get a formal education. So, but I think that part of that mandate, so part of the things that he was kind of struggling with as far as identity and how much, and within his work, and the artist who happens to be Native conversation. I think that a lot of what he was struggling with, because of my proximity to him, I've taken on as well and have studied over the course of my career. So it's something that kind of early on I was set up to pursue that way of thinking, or look into it more, not take it for granted, not just you're a Native artist, you're doing Native art, end of story. I wanted to know what the complication was there. So he had helped with that as well.
I'm going to turn to the questions, but one thing that I have always appreciated about you and your work, Andrea, is, you'll say, like, sometimes I just don't want my community to have to feel responsible for what I want to put out in the world. And I think, that is also an option, or, a way of thinking of it, because I know that even in my curator, we all feel beholden to our communities too, in a way, and in a way that I think people who are non-Indigenous don't feel, that they reflect their community out into the world. And I know that adds a little extra weight. And I wanted to follow up with what you said, Jolene, too, about these artists who are like, kind of appropriating the identity of indigeneity, and they may be Indigenous themselves, but they haven't been rooted in the community. And I remember, I think it was you, when somebody told you, you better get home and make corn or grow corn. Was that you that tells that story? So you did, just like when you say, let's show up for these younger artists, there's so many of us who, kind of either through no fault of our own or for the circumstances of our life, did grow up off res or away from our people. And, it's quite a journey back home. And you had an elder that, kind of helps you get on that path. So I really did like, what you were saying about, we do have an obligation to these young folks when we see that happening. So I'm going to turn to the Q&A because we're coming up on the close, and I want to make sure that I get some of these answered for us. The first one is from an anonymous attendee, and we did talk about this just a bit, but just in transparency, I'm going to read all the questions. If we understand Indigenous groups as nation states or having nationhood, should we consider Indigenous artists as global art more than or instead of American art? I don't know, maybe Bob, would you like to take that, or Andrea? No pressure.
Yeah, I'm kind of for this idea of breaking apart the boundaries and really, um, having artwork that's in conversation with one another and that's sort of put to, reinstalling galleries and museums in a way that just sort of dismantles the whole kind of old-fashioned way of doing things. And I would say that, again, I'm not an Indigenous art scholar. I was never trained in it. It's not what I'm doing. Um, I'm really trying to understand what the community wants and thinks and working with artists. So I would really like to hear about what Jolene and Andrea have to say about the idea of maintaining this kind of sovereignty and nationhood within Indigenous arts at these museums, or if that's, it's kind of going along the lines of the way the Western bins were. I don't know.
I don't know that I would use the term global, but I sometimes joke around when there's like a number of people from different Native nations. I'll be like, this is a real cool international event. Because there's, a lot of people will say intertribal, but sometimes I'll make that reference. I know that Heather Altone will sometimes bring up that Oklahoma, there are more languages, like languages spoken in Oklahoma than all of Europe, because there, so many Native nations were relocated to Oklahoma and there are so many speakers, but people don't usually think of Oklahoma as this hugely international place. So, that it is kind of a shift in thinking for when people hear that for the first time, or when we consider that there's, over 500 Native nations and what is now geopolitically the United States. That's another thing, that a nuance that I'm seeing coming up in a number of like artist bios and writing on Native people. When you'll talk about a geopolitical place like Chicago, it'll be the place that is now known as Chicago, like just to kind of temporarily, like not fix it, but that it could be in flux, that anything could change. I kind of like these sensitivities in the language, that this is because Native people are having conversations with these institutions and are like, well, do we really want to fix in settler futurity? Or is there room with how we describe things where we can slightly shift that? And American art, American is a geopolitical term that doesn't necessarily want to say, the Southern colonies versus Canada being the Northern colonies. There's a lot of denial, there's a lot of refusal in these categories, and we need to recognize it and find, kind of quick ways where people get it, and that's hard.
I kind of want to jump in here because this is for Jolene, and I'd love to hear your take on this, Jolene. But I remember one time, I wasn't at this interview, but Jill Albergil was telling me about it, that it was something for Hearts of Our People. And you said something to the effect of, yeah, well, I mean, if you think about it, America culture has only been about 500 years and Haudenosaunee is in the thousands of years. So, really, really speaking exactly to what Andrea is saying, like, does it necessarily mean that 500 years puts it as a forever kind of thing? So, and I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Thank you, Dakota. I mean, in this point, we do miss Arvo because I think he would bring the long lens comment to the table as well. In that, as Indigenous peoples, not only in the Americas, but globally, we occupy a very different position than many of our contemporary allied and settler peoples. And so Indigenous peoples, have been invested in maintaining relationships with their own communities, extended networks. There's a lot of contemporary discussion about a recommitment to this notion of kin or community. And I do think we're at a precipice in our communities today. It's, how is it we're going to imagine and practice continuing on in these cultural formations, and what role does our art play in that? And so the abstraction, the notion of art is for us, a really complex abstraction. because this process of making expressive culture, this space of, imagining our experience through these expressions of song, dance, what we think of as art, is something that, is really a fascinating kind of adaptation of a sort of hybrid, really complicated yet very synthesized space now in our cultures. And so, I think often about, well, what does art represent at large? And then what does it represent within our communities? And is it the same? And so there are a couple of things that I'm thinking about right now, and maybe it's, in this, what's wonderful is that, there are many things to think about in Indigenous experiences, and this is just one of them. And so this is the sort of thing that I've been thinking about lately. It's that if no one is interested in maintaining what we think of as traditional culture, and we know that tradition is the thing that changes the slowest in our communities. It's constantly evolving. It isn't fixed. What will we be in 50 years from now? What will we be in 100 years from now? And so our people have remained together for thousands of years. That's why I'm here in the room. You're here in the room as a Dakota person. You're here in the room as a Anishinaabe or Ojibwa person. That's why you're in the room. I'm here as a Haudenosaunee people. Our people have known each other for over 1,000 years. How many other peoples in the world think in those terms? Well, there are some, right? There are some dynastic, peoples in the world that think in those terms. And so I think that this is about us really having deeper conversations with each other about what's at stake for us. I mean, I do think, yes, there is the museum world, the curatorial world, the arts world. Yes, we're all involved in that in some way. But for us within our community, I think there's bigger issues to deal with. And so do we use these public spaces like this conversation to gesture towards those larger conversations as a signal to our peers, people from our communities, or do we continue to engage in conversations that are probably less strategic for us, And so, and so I think about, so in some way, all of these conversations right now, as we transit them through, as we transit them through other sort of colonial centers, and we unfortunately still have to look at the museum world in this way, the arts market in this way, how do we make it work for us, And so, so I do think there's that issue for us, and it's complicated, right? Because we're entering this discussion at a moment in time where the notion of nations is dissipating, the notion of fixed borders and people, having identities as being located in geopolitical spaces is dissipating. And so is that going to work for us, right? Is that going to work for us? Right. And so these, I think, are some of the questions that we have to begin to really face.
Which is, it's really such a shame I was, that Arvo couldn't be with us, although understandably, because I really would love to have some of the thoughts of our elders and our leaders, just, kind of weighing in on some of this stuff too. But I'm looking at the time and we are coming up on time. There are so many really good questions in the Q&A section, and I'm so sorry that we aren't going to get to all of them. But if, just quickly, Bob or Andrea, if there's one other thing you'd like to say before we close. And yeah, I want to thank all of you just for being here with me and tackling the complexities of this topic with me.
Thank you, Dakota, for bringing us together.
Um,
Thank you so
yes.
much.
Thank you, Dakota.